The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the endless expanse of the Texas desert. Lisa Harper adjusted her sunglasses and glanced at the map sprawled across the passenger seat of her car. The route to Blackwater was a lonely stretch of road, flanked by brittle shrubs and the occasional rusted sign, most of which had faded into near illegibility. She was chasing a story, a thread of whispers about a series of disappearances that had haunted the small, forgotten town for the past few months. The local authorities claimed there was nothing unusual, dismissing the disappearances as people leaving town. But Lisa knew better. The accounts she had gathered told a different story, people vanishing without a trace, some leaving behind half-eaten meals or running cars with doors wide open. The gas station was the first sign of life she'd seen in over an hour. Its neon sign flickered weakly, advertising cold drinks and full service, though the dilapidated pumps suggested otherwise. Pulling in, Lisa killed the engine and stepped out, the oppressive heat wrapping around her like a blanket. Inside, the air was stale and smelled faintly of old oil and dust. A grizzled man behind the counter looked up from his newspaper, squinting at her as if sizing her up. "Headed to Blackwater?" he asked, his voice gravelly and low. Lisa nodded. "You know much about it?" The man leaned back, his chair creaking ominously. "Enough to tell you it ain't a place for outsiders. Folks there, they don't take kindly to strangers pokin' around." "I'm a journalist," Lisa said, pulling out her notebook. "I'm investigating the disappearances." His eyes darkened. "Then you're more foolish than I thought. You won't find answers in Blackwater. You'll only find trouble." Undeterred, Lisa pressed him for details, but he only shook his head and muttered something under his breath about desert devils. As she left, he called after her, "Don't stop for no one, you hear me? Keep driving, if you want to make it out." Lisa ignored his warning. The road ahead seemed endless, but after another 20 miles, she finally saw it, a faded sign welcoming her to Blackwater, its paint chipped and peeling. The town itself was little more than a cluster of old buildings huddled together, as if trying to protect each other from the vast emptiness surrounding them. As she rolled into town, every head seemed to turn toward her car. A group of men sitting outside a general store stopped talking, their gazes heavy and unwelcoming. Lisa felt a shiver run down her spine. She parked in front of a small diner, the only place that looked remotely open. The bell above the door jingled as she stepped inside, and the smell of grease and coffee filled the air. The waitress behind the counter froze mid-motion, her eyes wide with a mix of curiosity and fear. "You're not from around here," the waitress said, setting down a chipped coffee pot. "No," Lisa replied, trying to sound casual. "I'm here about the disappearances." The waitress glanced toward the back of the diner, where a man sat alone, nursing a mug of coffee. His face was obscured by the brim of his hat, but Lisa could feel his gaze on her. "Be careful what you ask about," the waitress whispered. "Some questions don't have answers you want to hear." Lisa smiled politely but felt the growing tension in the room. Whatever secrets Blackwater held, it was clear the locals weren't eager to share. The diner's air felt heavier than it should have, laden with unspoken words and uneasy glances. Lisa sipped her lukewarm coffee, pretending not to notice the murmurs that passed between the waitress and the lone man at the back. She could feel his eyes boring into her, even as she kept her gaze fixed on the notepad in front of her. "Who's that guy?" Lisa asked the waitress, lowering her voice. The woman hesitated, her hand tightening around the edge of the counter. "That's Roy. He owns the old hardware store down the street. Been here longer than most." "Does he know anything about the disappearances?" The waitress shook her head quickly, her movements jittery. "You should drop it, miss. Blackwater's got a way of swallowing people whole. You ask too many questions, and it'll do the same to you." But Lisa wasn't one to be scared off. She left a tip on the counter and slid out of the booth, making her way toward Roy's table. His head lifted slightly as she approached, revealing weathered features and piercing blue eyes that seemed to see straight through her. "Roy, right?" she asked, sliding into the seat across from him without waiting for an invitation. He didn't respond, just stared at her with a look that could have been curiosity or disdain. "I'm a journalist," she said, pulling out her notebook. "I'm investigating the disappearances here in Blackwater. People are worried, but no one seems willing to talk." Roy leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking ominously. "And what makes you think I'm any different?" "Because you've been here longer than anyone else. You've seen things, heard things." Lisa leaned in, lowering her voice. "You know something, don't you?" For a moment, Roy didn't move. Then he chuckled softly, a dry, humorless sound. "You're a brave one, I'll give you that. But bravery won't save you here." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a crumpled photograph, sliding it across the table. Lisa picked it up and studied the image. It was a grainy black and white photo of a group of people standing in a circle around a stone altar. Their faces were obscured, but their posture radiated something primal, something wrong. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Roy leaned forward, his voice low and grave. "That's the Blackwater congregation. They've been here longer than this town, longer than the roads that brought you here. They worship something ancient, something that doesn't take kindly to being disturbed." Lisa's heart pounded. "You're saying there's a cult here? And they're behind the disappearances?" Roy nodded slowly. "They call it the Hollow One. A spirit of the desert, older than any of us. They believe it needs sacrifices to stay asleep, to keep from waking and unleashing its wrath." Lisa stared at him, the weight of his words pressing down on her. "And you've seen this? You've seen them do it?" Roy's eyes darkened. "I've seen enough to know that you don't mess with them. If you're smart, you'll get back in your car and drive as far away as you can." But Lisa wasn't smart. She was determined. "What about the people who've disappeared?" she pressed. "Are they alive?" Roy didn't answer, his gaze shifting to the window. Outside, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the street. "You're running out of daylight," he said finally. "If you want answers, you'll find them at the old church on the edge of town. But I'm warning you, once you step inside, there's no going back." Lisa stood, her determination hardening into resolve. "Thank you, Roy." As she walked out of the diner, she felt the eyes of every patron on her back. The air outside was cooler now, but it did little to soothe the chill that had settled deep in her bones. The old church loomed in the distance, its silhouette dark against the dying light of day. The old church stood at the edge of Blackwater like a sentinel guarding secrets too dark to reveal. Its weathered wood had turned grey with age, and the bell tower leaned slightly, as if weighed down by the sins of the past. A faint wind rustled the dry grass around it, carrying with it a low, mournful sound. Lisa parked her car a safe distance away, the engine ticking as it cooled in the evening air. The walk to the church felt longer than it should have, the barren land stretching endlessly around her. The closer she got, the more oppressive the air became, heavy with a sense of foreboding. The front doors were massive, their once bright paint peeling and flaking. A crude symbol had been carved into the wood, a circle with jagged lines radiating outward, like a twisted sun. Lisa ran her fingers over it, feeling the grooves. It didn't look like any symbol she recognized, and its design made her skin crawl. With a deep breath, she pushed the doors open. Inside, the church was dark, lit only by the faint glow of candles that lined the altar at the far end. The air smelled of wax, dust, and something metallic, like old blood. The pews were arranged in neat rows, though many of them were broken or missing planks. Lisa's footsteps echoed as she made her way down the center aisle. The altar was the focal point of the room, draped in a black cloth embroidered with the same twisted sun symbol. Behind it stood a large stone slab, stained with something dark and rust-colored. She pulled out her phone and began taking pictures, her hands trembling slightly. The flash illuminated the room in brief bursts, revealing faded murals on the walls. The paintings depicted strange figures in robes, their faces obscured, bowing before a massive, shadowy form that seemed to rise out of the desert itself. A noise broke the silence, a faint shuffling, like footsteps. Lisa spun around, her heart pounding. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely above a whisper. No answer. She took a cautious step forward, scanning the room. The shadows seemed to shift, the flickering candlelight playing tricks on her eyes. She told herself it was nothing, just her imagination running wild. But then she saw it, a figure standing at the far end of the room, just outside the light. It was tall and still, its features obscured by the darkness. "Who's there?" Lisa demanded, trying to sound braver than she felt. The figure didn't move, didn't respond. She reached for her phone, switching on the flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing a statue. It was humanoid but grotesquely distorted, its limbs elongated and its face featureless except for a gaping void where its mouth should have been. Lisa exhaled, relief washing over her. It was just a statue. But as she turned back toward the altar, she froze. The candles were out. The room was plunged into darkness, and the sound of shuffling footsteps grew louder, closer. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. She reached for her phone again, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. When she did, the beam revealed the same statue, only now, it was inches away from her. Its mouthless face seemed to lean toward her, and though it made no sound, Lisa swore she could hear a low, guttural whisper in her mind, "You shouldn't have come here." She stumbled back, her flashlight flickering. The room spun as a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread washed over her. She turned and ran, her footsteps echoing as she fled the church, the whispers growing louder with every step. When she burst through the doors into the night air, she was gasping for breath, her heart racing. She didn't stop until she reached her car, slamming the door shut and locking it. As she sat there, trying to calm herself, she noticed something in her rearview mirror. The twisted sun symbol was etched into her car's dusty rear window, as if drawn by an unseen hand. Lisa clenched the steering wheel, her resolve hardening. She knew now that whatever was happening in Blackwater was far more sinister than she had imagined. But she also knew she couldn't leave. Not yet. The drive back to the diner was a blur. Lisa's mind was still racing, her thoughts tangled in the horrific images she had just witnessed. The church, the symbol, the voice, or was it a voice? She couldn't tell anymore. Everything felt like a dream, a nightmare that clung to her like the desert dust on her skin. When she reached the diner, the place was quieter than before. The men who had been sitting outside were gone, and the waitress, who had given her that warning earlier, now stood at the counter with a vacant look in her eyes. Lisa hesitated for a moment but then walked in, pushing the door open with a sense of dread. The waitress didn't acknowledge her at first. She simply wiped down the counter with a cloth, her movements mechanical. Lisa took a seat at the far end, her fingers twitching with anxiety as she glanced over her shoulder. "Something happened at the church," Lisa said, breaking the silence. She was still trying to catch her breath. "Something, not right." The waitress turned slowly, her eyes darkening with a mix of fear and resignation. "I told you not to go in there. You don't know what you've done." Lisa sat up straighter. "What is it? What's going on in this town? What are they worshipping?" The waitress looked around nervously, then leaned in, her voice dropping to a whisper. "It's called the Hollow One." Lisa's heart skipped a beat. "The Hollow One? An ancient spirit," the waitress continued. "One that's been here long before this town was built. The congregation, they're the ones who keep it at bay. But not for long." Lisa's mind raced. "So they're behind the disappearances? They sacrifice people?" The waitress nodded, her face pale. Not just people. Anyone. Anything they can get their hands on. They offer it to the Hollow One to keep it from waking. They think if they stop, it will consume everything, Blackwater, the desert, the world. But it's already waking. Lisa felt a chill run through her. Waking? What do you mean, waking? The waitress glanced nervously toward the kitchen doors. I shouldn't be telling you this, but you need to know. The Hollow One is not like anything you've ever seen. It's not just a spirit. It's a force. It's the desert itself, emptiness, hunger, a void that devours everything in its path. The congregation believes it was born from the earth, a thing older than time itself. They think if they don't keep feeding it, it will destroy them all. Lisa's stomach twisted at the thought. And what happens when it's fully awake? The waitress shuddered. No one knows for sure. Some say it's already begun. The disappearances, they're the first signs. People aren't just vanishing. They're being taken. A sudden crash from the back of the diner made Lisa jump. She stood up instinctively, her heart racing. The waitress's face drained of color. They're here, she whispered, her voice barely audible. You need to leave. Now. Before Lisa could respond, the door to the kitchen swung open. A man, tall and thin, stepped into the dining area. His eyes were dark, sunken into his face as if he hadn't slept in days. He wore a long coat, and in his hand, he held a strange, twisted knife. Lisa's blood ran cold. The man's gaze locked onto hers, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fade away. He stepped closer, his movements deliberate and slow. Lisa instinctively backed away, her pulse pounding in her ears. You shouldn't have come here, the man said, his voice low and gravelly. You've seen too much. The waitress shrank back, her hands trembling. Leave her alone, Jonah, she pleaded, her voice shaking. She doesn't know what she's gotten into. Jonah's lips curled into a twisted smile. She's already in it. There's no turning back now. Lisa's breath hitched in her chest. What do you want from me? She demanded, her voice stronger than she felt. Jonah's smile faded, and he took another step forward. You're a part of this now. You've crossed the line. You're marked. Lisa didn't wait to hear any more. She turned and ran for the door, slamming it open as she bolted into the night. Her car was just across the street, and she raced toward it, not daring to look behind her. As she jumped into the driver's seat, she slammed the engine to life, the tires screeching as she peeled out of the parking lot. Her hands shook as she gripped the steering wheel, but her mind was clear. The Hollow One, the congregation, Jonah, they were all tied together in ways she still couldn't understand. But she knew one thing for certain, she couldn't leave. Not yet. Not until she uncovered the truth. Lisa drove through the darkened streets of Blackwater, the headlights illuminating the empty town. Every building she passed seemed to watch her, like silent witnesses to whatever darkness the town harbored. Her thoughts raced, but one question dominated her mind: what was the Hollow One, and how had it come to control this town? Her heart pounded as she recalled the man, Jonah. There was something about him that felt unnatural, like he wasn't entirely human. His dark eyes, the hollow look in his face, the knife he carried, it all felt wrong, like something out of a nightmare. She had narrowly escaped, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching her, waiting for the right moment. Lisa's mind flashed to the photograph Roy had shown her earlier, the one with the group of robed figures standing around the stone altar. The faces were obscured, but one thing was clear: they were participating in some kind of ritual, one that didn't belong in the modern world. She had been right about one thing: Blackwater was hiding something. But what was it? She parked outside the town's small library, an ancient stone building with ivy creeping up its walls. It was the only place she hadn't yet explored, and something told her it might hold the key to understanding Blackwater's terrifying secret. The door creaked as she pushed it open, stepping into the cool darkness of the library. The musty scent of old paper and dust filled the air. Rows upon rows of books lined the walls, some of them so old their spines had crumbled into dust. Lisa's fingers ran along the shelves, searching for something, anything that could explain what was happening here. In the far corner, a desk was stacked with faded journals and tattered books. She approached it cautiously, noticing a small sign that read, "Local History." Lisa thumbed through the piles until a small leather-bound book caught her attention. It looked ancient, its pages yellowed with age. The title was faded, but one word stood out, Blackwater. Opening the book, she scanned the pages, quickly skimming over the passages about the town's founding and early history. Nothing particularly unusual. But then, near the back, something caught her eye, a section about the founding congregation. She stopped and read the passage aloud, her voice trembling. The congregation of the Hollow One was formed in the early days of Blackwater's settlement. Its members believe that the desert holds an ancient force, a primal spirit that governs all life in the region. They refer to this entity as the Hollow One, an incomprehensible force that has existed since the dawn of time. The congregation's role is to appease the spirit by offering sacrifices. These sacrifices are said to prevent the Hollow One from waking, a process believed to be catastrophic for the town and the world itself. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. The words were clear, but the implications were terrifying. The Hollow One wasn't just a spirit, it was something far worse. The town had been built on the worship of this ancient, malevolent force. And now, it was waking. The book continued. Over the years, the congregation has kept their rituals secret, known only to a select few. They believe that once the Hollow One has been fully awakened, there will be no escape. The desert will consume all who remain, and the town of Blackwater will become nothing more than a hollow shell of its former self. Lisa slammed the book shut, her mind reeling. She had thought she was uncovering the truth, but now it felt like she was in the middle of a horror story, one that was still unfolding, one she was becoming part of whether she liked it or not. Her hand shook as she set the book back down. The door to the library creaked behind her, and she whipped around, her heart racing. Standing in the doorway was Jonah. "You shouldn't have come here," he said again, his voice colder than ever. Lisa backed away, her breath shallow. "What is this? Why are you doing this to these people? To me?" Jonah took a step forward, his eyes narrowing. "Because you don't understand. The Hollow One is not just a legend. It's a living, breathing force that has shaped everything here. The congregation doesn't worship it, they serve it. They feed it, to keep it from destroying us all. The disappearances. Those are the first signs. You were warned." Lisa swallowed hard. "What happens if the Hollow One wakes?" Jonah's lips curled into a grim smile. "It devours everything. The town. The people. The land. And once it's finished, it will turn its gaze elsewhere. No one escapes." Lisa could feel the room closing in on her, the air thick with dread. She needed to escape. But even as she turned to run, she knew deep down that there was no escaping Blackwater. Not now. Lisa bolted from the library, her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. Her heart thundered in her chest as she ran down the empty street, her footsteps echoing in the silence of the night. Behind her, she could hear Jonah's voice growing faint, but she didn't dare look back. Her mind was racing. Everything she thought she knew was crumbling. Blackwater, the Hollow One, the congregation, they were all part of something far darker than she could have ever imagined. She reached her car, her hands trembling as she fumbled for the keys. She slammed the door shut and locked it, her eyes darting around. The street was eerily quiet, as though the town was holding its breath. There was no sign of Jonah, no sound of movement. But Lisa knew better than to relax. She had seen too much. She had heard too much. The Hollow One was real, and whatever was happening in Blackwater wasn't over. She started the engine and sped out of the parking lot, the headlights slicing through the darkened streets as she drove toward the edge of town. The desert stretched out before her, vast and endless, like a black sea swallowing everything in its path. But as she neared the outskirts, something made her stop. A figure appeared in her headlights, standing in the middle of the road. She slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt just inches away from the person. It was Roy. His face was pale, his eyes wide and empty. He didn't move as Lisa threw open the car door, rushing to him. "Roy," she shouted, grabbing his arm. "What's going on? What are they doing to this town?" He didn't answer. Instead, his eyes locked onto hers, his lips parting in a silent plea. And then, the ground beneath them trembled. Lisa stumbled back, her body instinctively moving away from the shaking earth. A low rumble echoed from the distance, growing louder with each passing second. She turned toward the horizon, her heart sinking as the landscape shifted before her eyes. The desert was alive. The ground cracked, and from deep within the earth, something massive stirred. Shadows moved in the distance, too large to be explained by the flickering lights of the town. The air grew thick, oppressive, and the once still desert seemed to breathe with an ancient, terrifying rhythm. Roy's eyes flickered toward the horizon, and he shook his head. "It's too late," he whispered. "The Hollow One is awake. There's no stopping it now." Lisa's mind reeled. She had heard the stories, but now, standing on the edge of Blackwater, the reality was more horrific than she had ever imagined. The desert was a living, breathing entity, a force of nature so powerful that it could consume everything in its path. The congregation had been right all along, they were only keeping it at bay, and now the sacrifice had been made. "Roy!" Lisa cried, but he didn't respond. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, his body trembling. "What do we do? How do we stop it?" He took a shaky step back. "There's no stopping it," he said, his voice barely audible. "Once it starts, it doesn't stop. The town, it will be gone. Just like the others. Just like every town before it." Lisa's stomach churned as the rumbling grew louder. The desert was rising, and soon, it would be here. In the distance, she saw figures moving. People. The congregation, no doubt. They were gathering, standing in a circle at the edge of the town, their robes billowing in the wind. Lisa's heart skipped a beat when she saw Jonah among them, his face lit by the eerie glow of the desert. She wanted to run. She needed to escape, to get as far away from Blackwater as possible. But something inside her told her that leaving now would be a mistake. She had come this far, and she couldn't turn back. Lisa's eyes locked onto the congregation. They were preparing something, a ritual. She didn't know what it was, but she knew it was connected to the Hollow One's awakening. With trembling hands, Lisa pulled out her phone and started recording, knowing this could be her only chance to expose the truth. But just as she hit the record button, a figure stepped forward from the group. It was a woman, tall and imposing, with a face hidden behind a veil. She raised her hands to the sky, and the air seemed to crackle with energy. The rumbling grew deafening, and Lisa's stomach twisted with dread. The woman's voice rang out, deep and resonant, as if speaking a language that wasn't human. The ground trembled beneath them as the energy from the desert surged forward, twisting like a storm. Lisa stumbled back, the raw power of the moment threatening to swallow her whole. The world around her seemed to bend and warp, and for a brief, horrifying moment, she felt the desert closing in on her. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything went quiet. The desert was still. The figures were gone. The air was thick with an eerie silence. Lisa's heart raced as she looked around. Roy had vanished. The desert had swallowed him, just like it had swallowed so many before him. The Hollow One had awakened. And now, there was no escape. Lisa stood frozen in place, the oppressive silence of the desert pressing in on her. The air felt thick, as though something was holding its breath, waiting for the next move. The events of the last few moments seemed to hang in the air, suspended in time. Her phone was still in her hand, the screen now displaying the faint image of the woman in the veil, her arms raised toward the sky, as though calling forth something ancient and terrible. The rumbling had stopped, but Lisa could feel the weight of the Hollow One's presence lingering. She stumbled backward, her feet slipping on the loose earth. She had to get away, but the realization struck her hard, there was no escaping this. No matter how far she ran, the Hollow One was everywhere now. The desert itself had become alive, its hunger no longer a distant legend but a real, tangible force. And the congregation, they were part of it. They had welcomed it, fed it, and now, they had unleashed it on the world. Lisa's eyes darted toward the town. Blackwater looked different now. The lights were flickering, casting long, unnatural shadows across the streets. Buildings that had once seemed like a comforting backdrop now felt like prison walls closing in on her. She could still hear Jonah's words echoing in her mind, "You're marked. There's no turning back now." But she couldn't give up. She had come this far, and she had to find the truth. She had to understand what the congregation had done and what the Hollow One wanted. There was something in her, some thread of determination that refused to break, no matter how much the world around her twisted and bent. Her eyes scanned the horizon, where the earth still seemed to move, rippling like water. The desert was restless. Hungry. And somewhere out there, hidden beneath the shifting sands, was the source of it all. With a deep breath, Lisa made her decision. She wasn't going to run. Not this time. She started walking toward the heart of Blackwater, her legs heavy but resolute. She didn't know what would happen when she reached the town square, but she knew she had to get there. Whatever the congregation had done, it was there. It was always there, hidden beneath the town's quiet surface. As Lisa approached the center of town, she saw figures in the distance, moving in a slow procession. The congregation. They were gathering, standing in a circle, just as they had been earlier. But now, they weren't alone. Around them, the desert seemed to breathe, swirling in unnatural patterns, like a dark storm forming in the sky. The ground beneath their feet cracked and groaned as if it, too, was awakening. The woman in the veil stood at the center of the group. Lisa could feel her gaze, even from this distance, as though the woman knew she was there, knew she had come to witness the culmination of everything. And then, in that moment, it hit her, the truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. The congregation wasn't just trying to control the Hollow One. They were serving it. The sacrifices, the rituals, the silence of Blackwater, it was all part of a twisted, unholy pact. The Hollow One wasn't just a destructive force. It was a god, an ancient entity that had been worshipped for centuries, perhaps millennia. And Blackwater was its vessel. Lisa's mind raced. The town itself had been built to appease the Hollow One. The sacrifices, the disappearances, the strange behavior of the townspeople, it all made sense now. The Hollow One was not something to be feared or fought. It was something to be fed. And every person who vanished, every person who fell under the congregation's influence, had been offered to it. Lisa's chest tightened as she realized the full scale of the horror she had uncovered. The Hollow One had already begun to consume everything, Blackwater, its people, and now, it was turning its gaze to the world beyond. The desert was only the beginning. Her phone buzzed in her hand, snapping her out of her thoughts. She glanced down and saw a new message from Roy. "You can still stop it. The stone. It's the key. Find the stone, and you can undo everything." Lisa's heart skipped a beat. The stone. She looked up at the congregation, who were now chanting in unison, their voices a low hum that reverberated through the earth. Lisa knew that the stone had to be tied to the ritual. It was the source of their power, the means by which they controlled the Hollow One. Without thinking, Lisa turned and ran toward the edge of town. The message was clear: she had to find the stone. It was the only way to stop whatever had been set in motion. She sprinted toward the hills beyond Blackwater, where she remembered seeing a large stone formation earlier during her investigation. It had stood out to her then, but now, it seemed more important than ever. The air around her grew heavy as she ran, the desert closing in, as though it were trying to trap her. But Lisa pushed forward, refusing to be caught by the growing darkness. Finally, she reached the stone formation. The rocks loomed like ancient sentinels, their surfaces smooth and cold under her hands. She ran her fingers along the stone, searching for something, anything that would indicate its significance. And then, in a crack between two massive boulders, she found it. A symbol. The same twisted sun. It was carved into the stone, deep and sharp, just like the one she had seen at the church. Lisa's breath caught as she traced the lines, her mind racing. This was it. The stone was the key. But what did she have to do with it? How could she undo the damage? Lisa looked around, panic beginning to claw at her chest. The chanting from the town had grown louder, more frantic. The Hollow One was waking, and if she didn't act soon, it would consume everything. Then, she heard it, a voice. You cannot stop it. It's already too late. Lisa spun around, her heart stopping in her chest. Jonah stood there, his shadow stretching unnaturally behind him. His eyes were black. And the Hollow One's hunger was reflected in them. Lisa's pulse thundered in her ears as Jonah stepped closer, his form emerging from the shadows of the stone formation. The air around him seemed to warp, bending like heat rising from the desert floor. His eyes, those black, soulless eyes, locked onto hers with an intensity that sent a chill racing down her spine. You don't understand, do you? Jonah's voice was low, almost a growl. The Hollow One has already claimed this town. It has claimed you. There is no escape. You came here to expose us, to fight back, but it's too late. Lisa's breath hitched as she looked at him, the realization dawning on her. Jonah was not just part of the congregation, he was its agent, its enforcer. He wasn't just serving the Hollow One. He had become one of its instruments. There was no humanity left in him, only the cold, insatiable desire to feed the desert god. Why? Lisa whispered, her voice trembling. Why would you do this? Why let it consume everything? Jonah tilted his head slightly, a cold smile playing on his lips. Because it's not about survival. It's about power. The Hollow One offers us strength, immortality. We are its chosen, the few who have been allowed to witness its true form. The others, the ones who disappeared, were merely sacrifices to awaken it. To bring about its reign. Lisa's mind raced, trying to piece together the broken fragments of truth that had been revealed to her. The Hollow One was not just an ancient force, it was a god, a being of unimaginable power, one that had been worshipped by the congregation for generations. And now, it had been awakened. She looked back at the stone, the symbol etched into its surface, glowing faintly under the dim light of the moon. The stone was connected to the Hollow One, to the ritual. It was the anchor that tied the desert god to this world. But was it also the key to stopping it? You think you can stop it, Jonah said, as if reading her thoughts. But you're just a mortal. A fleeting thing. The Hollow One is eternal. Lisa swallowed hard, her fingers tightening around the phone in her hand. Roy's message. The stone was the key. She didn't know how, or what it would take, but she couldn't back down now. She couldn't let Jonah, or the Hollow One, win. I'm not going to let you destroy everything, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. I won't let this happen. Jonah's smile widened, and for a brief moment, it was as though the very air around them thickened, pulsating with an unnatural energy. The desert seemed to breathe in tandem with his presence, as if it were listening, waiting. "You already have," Jonah said, his tone eerily calm. "The ritual is in motion. There is no undoing it. You should have left when you had the chance." Lisa's eyes darted to the stone once again. The symbol, the twisted sun, was the heart of the ritual. But it was more than that. It was the source of the Hollow One's power, the binding force between the god and the earth. If she could destroy it. The ground beneath her feet shifted, and for a moment, Lisa thought the entire desert was about to swallow her whole. But then she steadied herself, a surge of determination coursing through her. With a deep breath, Lisa turned back to Jonah, who was standing still, as if waiting for her to make her next move. His expression was calm, almost disinterested, as though he already knew what she would do. She raised the phone, the small screen lighting up in the darkness. Jonah's eyes narrowed. "You think that's going to stop me?" he spat, but his words were drowned out by the deafening sound of the earth beginning to tremble once more. Lisa ignored him. Her fingers flew across the screen, searching for a signal, anything to help her. She needed answers, a way to destroy the symbol, the stone, whatever it took. And then she found it. A map. A journal entry. The stone is the anchor, but it is not indestructible. To sever the connection, one must strike at the heart of the symbol itself. Only the blood of the chosen can undo the ritual. Her heart skipped a beat. The blood of the chosen. That was it. It had to be. The Hollow One could only be banished if someone marked by the ritual sacrificed their blood to destroy the symbol. But was she marked? Could she really do it? Jonah seemed to sense her hesitation. He took a step forward, his eyes gleaming with dark amusement. "You think you can undo what has been done? You think your blood matters to the Hollow One? It wants you to try. It wants you to fail." Lisa clenched her fists. She didn't have much time. The town, the desert, the entire world was on the edge of annihilation. If she didn't act now, everything she had witnessed, everything she had uncovered, would be for nothing. The ground quaked again, more violently this time, and the symbols on the stone began to glow brighter, as though the desert itself was feeding on the ritual. Lisa took a deep breath and made her choice. She drew her knife, the one she had found earlier in the library, its cold blade gleaming in the pale light of the moon. Jonah's grin faltered as he watched her, as though he finally realized what she intended. Without a word, Lisa plunged the knife into her palm, a sharp, stinging pain shooting up her arm. The blood trickled from her hand, falling onto the stone beneath her feet. The moment it touched the symbol, the air around them shifted, like a thunderclap, a wave of force rippled outward from the stone, shaking the very foundation of Blackwater. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. She felt the Hollow One's presence falter, its grip on the land weakening, even as the desert raged with a fury she could barely comprehend. And then, everything went dark. The darkness was all-encompassing. For a moment, Lisa felt as though she had been swallowed whole by the earth, her body weightless and suspended in the void. The sharp pain in her hand from the knife wound faded, replaced by a coldness that seeped deep into her bones. It was as if the desert itself had pulled her into its depths, and she was drowning in the weight of its ancient power. But then, she felt it, the shift. A deep, violent pull in the very fabric of reality. The air crackled with energy, and Lisa's heart pounded against her chest as though it, too, was caught in the storm. She gasped for breath, her hands reaching out instinctively as if to grasp something solid in the void. And then, the world snapped back into place. Lisa found herself standing in the same place, but everything was different. The desert was still alive, but the storm that had been brewing was now dissipating, as if it had lost its force. The symbols on the stone were still glowing, but their light had dimmed, flickering like a dying flame. The ground beneath her feet trembled, but it no longer felt like the pulse of something ancient and hungry. For the first time since arriving in Blackwater, Lisa felt a flicker of hope. She stumbled back, her breath ragged, and looked around. Jonah was still there, his dark eyes fixed on her, but there was something different about him. The emptiness in his gaze had shifted, as though the Hollow One's presence was beginning to wane. The stone beneath her feet pulsed faintly, as if in protest. "What have you done?" Jonah's voice was hoarse now, stripped of its earlier confidence. Lisa didn't answer. She could feel the energy of the Hollow One growing weaker, but it wasn't gone, not yet. She had to finish what she started. With a final glance at Jonah, she turned toward the stone. Her heart pounded in her chest as she took a step forward, her hand still dripping blood onto the cracked surface. The Hollow One's power had been weakened, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. She reached out, her fingers brushing against the glowing symbols, and a surge of energy shot through her. The air around her hummed, vibrating with a deep, resonant tone that seemed to shake the very earth. The desert itself groaned in response, but this time, the sound wasn't one of hunger, it was one of pain. The connection between the Hollow One and the land was weakening, breaking apart like fraying threads. Lisa could feel it, the ancient, malevolent force was slipping away, but it wasn't an easy process. The energy from the stone surged through her, trying to force her back, to make her let go, but Lisa held on. She couldn't stop now. She had to finish it. Jonah moved toward her, his face contorted in fury. "You think you can stop it? You think your blood means anything to the Hollow One? You're just a pawn. Nothing more." Lisa's grip tightened on the stone, and she felt the power surge once more, this time violently. It was as though the desert itself was fighting against her, clawing at her very soul. The ground beneath her feet cracked open, and the sand began to swirl around her, rising in a spiraling vortex. Jonah's voice became a distant echo as the storm of energy intensified. Lisa's vision blurred, and she could no longer tell where the desert ended and where the Hollow One's presence began. It was all-consuming, all-powerful. But there was a thread of resistance, a small flicker of light in the darkness. She had to hold on to that. With a final cry, Lisa pushed forward, her palm pressing harder against the stone. The desert shuddered, and the ground beneath her feet splintered as a blinding light erupted from the center of the symbol. The light was blinding, sharp and searing, and for a moment, Lisa thought she was going to be consumed by it. But then, it stopped. The desert fell silent. Lisa collapsed to her knees, gasping for air, her body trembling. The stone beneath her hand was now cold, lifeless, and the symbols that had once glowed with an otherworldly light were now dull and faded. The Hollow One's power had been severed, and the desert had begun to reclaim its stillness. The wind blew gently through the desert, carrying with it the faint scent of dry earth. The world felt calm. The tension that had clung to the air since her arrival in Blackwater seemed to have lifted, leaving only a quiet emptiness in its place. But as Lisa looked up, she saw Jonah standing just a few feet away, his form now flickering, as if he were dissolving into the very air. His eyes were wide, his mouth agape in disbelief. The Hollow One was no longer with him, it was gone, leaving only a hollow shell of the man who had once served it. Lisa stood shakily to her feet, her hands still trembling as she looked at Jonah. His body shuddered, his eyes now filled with an eerie emptiness. "You were always just a pawn," Lisa said, her voice steady despite the chaos that had just unfolded. Jonah opened his mouth as if to speak, but no words came out. Instead, he crumbled to the ground, his body disintegrating into dust before her eyes. Lisa watched in silence as the last remnants of Jonah vanished into the desert wind. The town of Blackwater was still. The storm had passed. But Lisa knew this was just the beginning. The Hollow One had been banished, yes, but the darkness it had left behind would take years to unravel. The town was gone, swallowed by its own twisted history. And though she had uncovered the truth, she couldn't shake the feeling that something else was still out there. Something darker. The desert had been quieted for now, but its hunger had not been sated. Lisa turned away, her heart heavy with the weight of what she had done. The truth would be uncovered, but the cost had been greater than she could have ever imagined. Blackwater's story had ended, but hers had only just begun. As she walked away, the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, casting a pale glow across the desert. It was a new day. But the echoes of the past would never truly fade. The wind still whispered through the arid landscape, carrying with it the faintest trace of something ancient. Lisa didn't look back. She couldn't afford to. The journey had taken everything she had, but somehow, she knew it wasn't over. The Hollow One had been banished, its grip loosened, but its legacy would linger, like the dust in the air, impossible to shake off. Lisa had uncovered the truth behind Blackwater, and now, the truth was spreading, inching its way across the world like a stain that refused to be washed clean. She wasn't sure what would happen next, if anyone would believe her, if anyone would listen. The town was gone, its history erased, its people reduced to nothing more than whispers in the wind. But Lisa knew that the Hollow One's shadow still hung over the land. She had left Blackwater behind, but as she drove across the endless desert highway, she couldn't shake the feeling that it had followed her. That the desert had swallowed more than just the town, it had taken a part of her with it. The image of Jonah's crumbling body, the way he had disintegrated into dust without a fight, haunted her. She had severed the connection between the Hollow One and Blackwater, but what of the other towns? What of the places where the Hollow One's influence had seeped in unnoticed? Lisa had seen the signs, the subtle shift in the air, the way people had changed once the congregation had taken root. It wasn't just Blackwater. The Hollow One's touch had spread far beyond the town's borders. She had uncovered one of its many secrets, but there was more. Much more. Lisa pulled over at a small gas station, the bright lights flickering weakly against the encroaching darkness of the desert night. She stepped out of the car, stretching her legs as she looked up at the vast expanse of stars. The world felt empty, as though the land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. She shivered, not from the cold, but from the weight of what she had learned. The phone in her pocket buzzed, snapping her out of her thoughts. She pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was an unknown number. Taking a deep breath, she answered. Lisa, a familiar voice said, the tone low and strained. We need to talk. It was Roy. Her pulse quickened. Where are you? She asked, scanning the darkness around her. I'm at the old library. You need to come back. There's more you need to know. Lisa's heart skipped a beat. The old library. The place where everything had started. Where she had first uncovered the whispers of the congregation and the Hollow One. She had thought she was done with it. But if Roy was calling her back, it meant there was more to this story than she had imagined. I'm not going back to Blackwater, she said, her voice firm. That place is gone. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Roy's voice came again, quieter this time. It's not just Blackwater. This goes deeper than you think. It's spreading. Lisa's stomach twisted. She had known it. The Hollow One had never been contained to just one town. It was a force, an ancient entity, that moved like a storm across the land, leaving destruction in its wake. The congregation was just the beginning. The world was full of forgotten places, of secrets buried beneath the surface. And if the Hollow One had been able to take root in Blackwater, it could take root anywhere. You don't understand, Roy continued. The ritual you stopped, it wasn't the end. It was just the first step. The Hollow One's power is connected to something far older, far darker. And it's only a matter of time before it rises again. Lisa's breath caught in her throat. What do you mean? If it's still out there, how do we stop it? Roy's voice was grim. There's only one way. We have to find the source. The heart of the Hollow One. It's tied to the land itself, to places like Blackwater, places where the desert has marked its territory. You've only scratched the surface. The air around Lisa grew colder as the reality of his words sank in. This wasn't over. The fight had only just begun. I'm on my way, she said, her voice tight with resolve. As she hung up the phone, a sense of purpose washed over her. Lisa knew what she had to do. She couldn't let the Hollow One spread any further. She had to find the source. She had to find a way to destroy it for good. But deep inside, a voice whispered doubts. The Hollow One was ancient, older than anything Lisa could truly understand. The rituals, the symbols, they were just pieces of a much larger puzzle. And even if she did find its heart, how could she destroy something so powerful, so rooted in the very earth itself? As Lisa climbed back into her car, she couldn't help but feel that she was heading towards something far worse than what she had already faced. The road ahead was long, and the truth was more twisted than she had ever imagined. The Hollow One was still out there, lurking, waiting for the right moment to rise again. But she would find it. She would stop it. And she wouldn't rest until it was gone. The drive felt endless, the miles stretching out like the desert itself, a barren expanse that offered no respite, no escape. Lisa's hands gripped the wheel, her knuckles pale in the glow of the dashboard lights. She had to find Roy, had to understand what he meant by the heart of the Hollow One. If she could stop it at its source, she might be able to end this nightmare once and for all. But something gnawed at her, a growing unease that she couldn't shake. The desert was silent, and it felt as though it was watching her, waiting for her to make the wrong move. The sky above, speckled with stars, was a void, a blackness so vast it swallowed all light. The world around her seemed desolate, abandoned by time itself. Blackwater had been the epicenter, but now, with its destruction, Lisa knew that the ripples were spreading. What if the Hollow One's influence had already seeped into other towns? Other places? What if it was already too late? As the hours passed, the car's engine hummed, and Lisa's thoughts began to blur. She thought of Jonah, the man she had fought so hard to stop. His body had disintegrated, consumed by the Hollow One's power, and yet she couldn't shake the image of his eyes. There had been something human in them, a flicker of recognition just before he had vanished. Had he truly been beyond redemption? Or had he, too, been caught in something far larger than himself? Lisa tried to push the thoughts aside, but they clung to her, pulling her deeper into the darkness. She couldn't let herself be consumed by doubt. She had a mission. She had to finish what she had started. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Lisa arrived at the old library. The building stood in stark contrast to the empty desert around it, a forgotten monument to a time long past. Its windows were cracked, the once proud columns now chipped and worn by years of neglect. The dim light from inside cast long shadows across the cracked pavement, as though the library itself was trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. Lisa stepped out of the car, her boots crunching against the dry ground as she approached the entrance. The door was slightly ajar, and she pushed it open cautiously, the hinges creaking in protest. The musty scent of old paper and dust filled the air as she entered. "Roy?" she called out softly, her voice echoing through the empty hall. There was no answer. But Lisa wasn't surprised. She knew he would be here somewhere, hiding among the stacks of forgotten books, lost in the secrets of the past. She could feel the weight of the knowledge that had been buried here, the ancient texts that had been hidden away to protect the world from what lurked beneath. She had seen the way the congregation had twisted the past to suit their purposes. The Hollow One's power was ancient, but it had been forgotten for a reason. Lisa walked deeper into the library, her footsteps muffled by the thick layer of dust on the floor. The shelves were lined with books, their spines cracked and faded, their pages yellowed with age. She scanned the titles, searching for something that might give her a clue. But there was nothing. The answers were hidden somewhere in these pages, but where? Suddenly, a soft rustling sound broke the silence, followed by a low voice. Lisa. She turned, her breath catching in her throat as she saw Roy standing at the back of the library, his figure bathed in the dim light from a nearby lamp. His face was pale, and there was something haunted in his eyes, a deep, unsettling weariness that seemed to stretch beyond anything she had seen before. Roy, Lisa said, her voice filled with both relief and fear. What's going on? You said there's more, that it isn't over. Roy nodded slowly, his gaze distant as he stepped forward. It's worse than I thought, Lisa. You were right to stop the ritual in Blackwater. But that was just the beginning. The Hollow One's influence isn't tied to just one place. It's tied to everything, to the land, to the people. Wherever the desert touches, the Hollow One leaves its mark. Lisa felt a chill run down her spine as Roy's words sank in. She had known that the Hollow One was ancient, but she hadn't fully understood the scope of its reach. It wasn't just a god, it was a force of nature, a malignant entity that fed on the very essence of the earth itself. I don't understand, Lisa said, her voice trembling. What do you mean, wherever the desert touches? Roy's eyes darkened as he stepped closer. The Hollow One is tied to the desert, to the places where life struggles to survive. It feeds on isolation, on the land's emptiness. Blackwater was just one of its many anchors, but there are others. Other places where its influence has spread, where the land itself has been corrupted. Lisa felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She had thought that by stopping the ritual in Blackwater, she had severed the Hollow One's connection to the land. But now, it seemed like the true battle was just beginning. How do we stop it? Lisa asked, desperation creeping into her voice. What do we do now? Roy's face grew grim. We need to find the heart of the Hollow One. The source of its power. It's hidden somewhere, deep in the desert, in a place where even the congregation doesn't dare to go. It's ancient, older than the town, older than any of us. But it's the key to everything. If we destroy it, we can stop the Hollow One for good. Lisa nodded, her mind racing. She had already faced unimaginable horrors, but this was different. She wasn't just fighting to save one town. She was fighting to save everything. I'm ready, she said, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her chest. Where do we start? Roy glanced down at a map spread across a nearby table. His fingers traced a route, leading to a place far off the beaten path, beyond the towns, deeper into the heart of the desert. It's going to be dangerous, he said quietly. But it's the only chance we have. Lisa didn't hesitate. She could feel the weight of the task ahead, the darkness that loomed just beyond the horizon. But she also knew one thing for certain, the Hollow One had already taken too much. And she wasn't going to let it take any more. The desert was vast, an endless sea of sand stretching far beyond the horizon. Lisa's eyes scanned the landscape, taking in the sheer emptiness, the way the heat shimmered off the ground, creating a mirage of distance and isolation. It was a world where time seemed to stand still, where the past and present blended into a single, suffocating moment. She and Roy had driven for hours, the endless road ahead of them mirroring the stillness in the air. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the desert was bathed in the eerie glow of twilight. The fading light seemed to carry with it a sense of finality, as if the world itself were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Roy had been silent for most of the journey, his face drawn and pale, his eyes distant. Lisa could feel the tension in the car, the unspoken fear that hung between them. They were headed toward the heart of the Hollow One's power, a place that even the congregation feared. It was an ancient site, a place where the land itself had been twisted by the dark forces that had taken root there. And somewhere within that twisted landscape lay the key to destroying the Hollow One for good. The map Roy had shown her was crude, the route marked with faint symbols that only he seemed to understand. They had crossed into territory that was marked only by old, faded roads, barely visible tracks that led deeper into the desert, farther from civilization. Lisa knew that this was no ordinary mission. This was a final descent into the unknown. As the car rumbled over the uneven terrain, Roy spoke for the first time in hours. "Lisa," he said, his voice low, "are you sure you're ready for this? Once we reach the site, there's no turning back. The Hollow One's power will be stronger than anything you've faced so far. It's not just a fight for survival, it's a battle for your soul." Lisa's grip tightened on the wheel, the dust swirling outside, mixing with the dimming sky. She had come too far to turn back now. She had seen the destruction the Hollow One had wrought, the way it had taken root in the land, in the people. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everything. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at her insides. "We have to end this. For Blackwater. For everyone." Roy didn't respond immediately, but Lisa could see the flicker of something, regret, maybe, pass across his face. He wasn't just leading her into danger, he was leading her into a place he had once feared. It was clear that he, too, was haunted by what lay ahead. But the silence between them spoke volumes. They were both committed to the same goal, no matter the cost. As the last rays of the sun disappeared behind the horizon, a chilling stillness descended upon the desert. The temperature dropped suddenly, and the wind that had been a constant companion now ceased entirely, leaving only the sound of their tires crunching over the desert floor. The car's headlights illuminated the path ahead, but the darkness seemed to swallow everything else. In the distance, Lisa could just make out the outline of something, a structure, perhaps. A building, long forgotten and weathered by time. Roy's voice was barely a whisper. "We're close." Lisa's heart pounded in her chest. They had reached the edge of something ancient. As they drew closer, the landscape began to change. The sand shifted, and the air felt heavier, thick with an unnatural stillness. It was as if they were entering a place where the very earth had been poisoned, a place where the Hollow One's presence was still strong. Roy slowed the car to a stop, the tires skidding slightly on the loose sand. He glanced at Lisa, his face pale and strained. "This is it," he said quietly. "The heart of it all." Lisa opened the door and stepped out into the desert, the cold air biting against her skin. She looked around, her eyes adjusting to the darkness. Before her stood a massive stone structure, half buried in the sand. It was unlike anything she had ever seen, a forgotten monument to something ancient, its surface covered in strange symbols, etched into the rock like a warning. Roy stood beside her, his eyes fixed on the structure. "The Hollow One's power is tied to this place. It was built as a temple, a site of worship. But it's not just a temple, it's a prison, a cage for something much older. Something we're not meant to understand." Lisa approached the structure cautiously, the ground beneath her feet shifting with each step. The air around her felt thick, oppressive, as though the land itself was alive, watching them. The symbols on the stone seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, their glow faint but unmistakable. "This is where it all started," Roy continued, his voice distant. "The Hollow One was summoned here long ago, bound to this place by those who thought they could control it. But they failed. And now, its influence has spread, like a poison in the land." Lisa reached out, her fingers brushing against the cold stone. The symbols flared to life, their light growing stronger, and she felt a sudden jolt of power shoot through her, as though the very ground beneath her was alive with ancient energy. "Be careful," Roy warned, his voice trembling. "The Hollow One doesn't want to be disturbed. It won't let us leave easily." Lisa nodded, taking a deep breath. This was it. The heart of the Hollow One's power. The source of its dark influence. She could feel the weight of it, the danger that lurked just beyond the veil. They were at the center of it all now. And they had no choice but to face it. The wind kicked up once more, and the temperature dropped again, sending a shiver down Lisa's spine. The world around them seemed to darken, and she knew that the Hollow One was close, closer than ever before. "Are you ready?" Roy asked, his voice filled with a sense of finality. Lisa took a steadying breath, her heart pounding in her chest. She had come too far to back down now. The Hollow One had taken too much from the world, from the people of Blackwater. She would stop it, no matter the cost. "I'm ready," she said, her voice steady as the desert wind howled around them. And with that, they stepped into the heart of darkness.